All right, I think we're ready to go. Welcome, everybody, to this Asking Anything with Bernardo Kastrup. My name's Jack. I'm hosting this event together with my co-host, Raman. Really glad you guys could make it today. Glad you could make it today, Bernardo. Thank you for being here.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. For round two, I think I'm going to skip the introductions today. This is the analytic idealism server after all, and I don't think we need to introduce Bernardo a second time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start where we left off and ask a question by Sarmaka. And he asks, how are you, man?
Doing great. Thank you. A little bit of a headache today, but that's part of life.
Yeah, how is your tinnitus, by the way? Is it bad today?
This week it has been worse. May have to do with the allergy season. I don't know. But I don't... let's not go there. It's
fine.
It's something I have to live with. And I found peace with it. So it's okay.
All right. Okay, then I'm going to just start with a question that I'm interested in. And that's, I'm curious, what's the last book you've read that was not written by you and that you would highly recommend? Something that you read recently, or a good author maybe that you would be like, you guys should really read them.
I am very enthusiastic about the last book I read. I finished it in the bath yesterday, so it's very recent and it's still reverberating in my mind, but it's something really, really niche. It's the proceedings of a conference on the philosophy and theology of Nicolaus Cusanus, Nicolai von Cues, the German philosopher bishop from the 15th century, who used to live close to where I am. I'm in the south of the Netherlands, used to live in the valley of the river Mosel in Dutch, Moselle in French, 3 hours from where I am. And he had some ideas that were, I don't know, 5 centuries before his time in the West. Some ideas about, the relationship between intellect and a form of knowing that he called ignorance knowing, which was also a form of not knowing. Some fascinating ideas about the notion that freedom and obedience were not opposites. They were actually one and the same thing. One needed the other. There is no freedom without obedience. There is no obedience without freedom. And all of that is in a theological context. And there were several articles, several theologians and scholars writing about their thoughts on Cusanus. He goes by many names. Nicolaus von Cues is the German name. Nicola Cusanus, which means from Cusa, and Cusa is the Latinized version of Cues, which today is the municipality of Bernkastel-Kues in Germany, West Germany. So people use different versions of his name in those proceedings, and there's a conference held in Finland, of all places. I think it was in 2004, and half the articles are in English. Luckily, the other half is in German. That's a little bit more of a struggle. But I am fascinated by the philosophy of Cusanus, and I'm starting to have ideas about how to try and make it more well-known, better known in the West. Like, we have some well-known philosophers in the West from that period of time. Aquinas is maybe the best known of them all. But who ever heard of Cusanus, and perhaps one of the most important philosophers of the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance?
Thanks, because I've never heard of him. So if you can let me know the name, or if someone here knows the name, or if Raman knows the name, or who Bernardo's talking about, then I can put it in the description for people who are interested.
Do a search on Nicolas de Cusa or Nicolas Cusanus of Nicolai von Cues, one of these names. You'll get there. You'll get to at least to Wikipedia. There is an article on him.
Thank you, Bernardo. Thank you. I forgot to say for the people who are listening in today, you can ask Bernardo your question yourself. There's a hand icon at the bottom. Just click it. You guys will queue up for questions. Raman, do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. So this is a question coming from me, and when I abandoned materialism, I quickly became a dualist. So I was wondering, when you abandoned physicalism, did you lean towards any ontology that wasn't idealism?
Can you restate the question? At what time? When I was still a materialist, you mean?
No. Like after you abandoned physicalism, did you
Yeah.
find any ontology other than idealism kind of convincing?
No. Dualism is so fundamentally problematic from the very beginning. One might even have to ask whether it's coherent for there to be interactions between two fundamentally distinct ontological substrates. There are arguments in that direction. That the best ones were put forward by a friend of mine, Henry Stapp, the physicist, the last surviving member of the original generation of quantum physicists. He put forward a very coherent argument within the boundaries of its assumptions that through the nonlinear process in quantum mechanics that popularly goes by the name of collapse, that collapse could offer an avenue for the interaction between two ontologically different substrates without violating energy conservation and without violating the other problems or even causal closure. And that was the best argument I have seen so far. But as it turns out, Henry himself, for several years now, is an idealist. So he himself sort of went down that line of thinking and concluded we don't need to postulate another fundamentally different substrate beyond the one we know by direct acquaintance, which is experience, internal experience or perceptual experience. And panpsychism, I toyed with it for a little while, but it doesn't hold up to the physics. It makes certain naive assumptions about what physics says that actually contradict a slightly deeper understanding of physics. In quantum field theory, which is the most tested, most refined, the best scientific theory we've had in the entire history of human thought, it tells us that there are no such things as particles. Particles are metaphors for local patterns of excitation of a field, and the field is not spatially bound. And some people argue that, yeah, but we have Bohmian mechanics, that it is an alternative to quantum field theory. Yes, but it doesn't have a relativistic extension. You cannot reconcile it with general relativity. That's one big problem. There are other more specific technical problems about Bohmian mechanics. And in 2018, there has been an experimental falsification of Bohmian mechanics. It didn't get much press coverage because it's such a niche topic in physics anyway. Very few physicists take it seriously to begin with, so that it was experimentally disproven. It's like, didn't make waves. But for you to have, and I think this is a very fundamental principle. I'm not a physicist, although I have breathed physics since very early on in my life. But if you do not have a field extension to quantum mechanics, you have no chance to reconcile it with general relativity. And the moment you make a field extension, you will contradict the basic assumption of panpsychism, which is that elementary particles are actually spatially bound little particles, literally. And that's not the case. That's just a metaphor.
Well, for me personally, I find neutral monism most convincing in regards to all the alternatives. I'm an idealist, but if I had to choose one thing, it would be neutral monism.
I tell you why I don't choose it, because don't take this personally. I would have said it even if you hadn't told me that you are sympathetic to that. Neutral monism is sort of hiding behind ignorance. It basically says, we don't know what the fundamental substrate of nature is, but it expresses itself in the form of matter, and it expresses itself in the form of mind. So matter and mind are aspects of this third unknown thing that we have no direct or indirect acquaintance with, because all we know are its aspects, matter and mind. I think that's unnecessary. It postulates not only matter, which is already unnecessary, but even something extra, something beyond matter, even more abstract, even more beyond any direct empirical evidence. And I don't think it's necessary. I think mind is sufficient to account for everything. Physicalism is unparsimonious because it already postulates this physical stuff. All we have is the experience of the world. And then neutral monism goes one step further and say, no, even the physical abstract stuff is not enough. There is yet one other thing that we do not perceive even indirectly, because all we have is already the indirection of matter. To me, that doesn't hold water. And look, I think that it is a throwback to a different time. Spinoza was a sort of multi-aspect monist. You could call him a neutral monist today, although he was not neutral. He said that the substance of nature is God. So he gave a name to it, even though he didn't give a definition. So, okay, sort of neutral monism. But he lived in a time in which the word mind, Greek version psyche, Latin version mente, is a synonym to soul. And in his time, in the 17th century, the common cultural assumption in Europe was that only people have souls. Animals don't have souls. That was the theology of the time, the dogma of the time, and people were born under that, quote, reality, and there was no questioning that. So when Spinoza would, if Spinoza had said in his time that the substrate of nature is mind, he would have been extraordinarily anthropocentric, because only people have mind. So what about the rest of nature? And to avoid that, he didn't use the word. That's my interpretation, and that's my fantasy about what was going on in his mind. To avoid that, he would not use the word mente or psyche, because that was a very sort of pedestrian human thing. And when he was talking about cosmology, he was talking about the nature of the whole of reality. And then he was saying that human mind is, I mean, that couldn't add up for him. So he became a neutral monist, and human mind was an aspect of the substrate of nature. And if you followed my argument until now, you will realize that it's completely consistent with analytic idealism. Human minds are indeed an aspect of the mind of nature, a dissociated aspect that has evolved higher level mental functions. So I think if Baruch and I could, well, Benedict, he changed his name later in life. If Benedict and I could sit to have, unfiltered wheat beer along the canals of Amsterdam, or where our host Jack is right now, and have a beer together and chat about it, I think he would have said, yeah, now that we sort of drill down into what we mean by these words, I think you're right, because you see, what is the essence of God for a 17th century mind? The essence of God is omniscience. And that's mind stuff. That's mind, the characteristic of mind. But yeah, we will never know, because he's not around to confirm or deny my interpretation.
I have a question from Cecily, and that's, would you debate David Chalmers? Have you ever talked with him about analytic idealism? And if so, what are his arguments against?
We had conversations about it. We had once a conversation in a restaurant very high up in one of the tallest buildings in Shanghai. and there was alcohol going around. So we had a conversation. Dave is not an analytic idealist, at least not last time I saw. He wrote a paper with a sort of a systematic classification of the different variants of idealism in 2018. So he is aware of the issues. I will be participating in an event with him this month at Chapman University. But he will come only at the end to sort of make a summary and classify everything that was said. It's a physics conference in which both of us were invited. Maybe there I will have an opportunity based on his feedback, based on what he will say as for what his positions are today. But Dave is focusing more not on making choices. He's focusing more on sort of drawing the map of the philosophical territory. What are the options going around? What are people saying? How do the different positions compare to one another? What are their differences, their commonalities? So he's drawing the maps of new philosophical territory, actually very old philosophical territory, but we've been there long ago, we've forgotten, and we need to draw the maps again. So I'm not sure that he holds to any specific position, but he has public opinions now that do contradict analytic idealism. He says that, at least last time I spoke to him, he says that he doesn't see any fundamental reason why the internet couldn't be conscious in and of itself. In other words, to have its own private conscious inner life. I think that doesn't add up. I don't think that holds water at all. And it's an implication of analytic idealism that doesn't hold water. So yeah, I don't think Dave is an analytic idealist at all. No.
I did read that.
I would debate him. I would debate him. Sure. It would be a lot of fun.
I did read that paper he put out with idealism and the mind-body problem, and he kind of insinuates that idealism is as equally implausible as panpsychism. Do you know where he's coming from? What's his argument against idealism?
I don't recall exactly what he says in that paper. I think what most people have in their intuition that steers them away from idealism is this notion that the world outside cannot be mental because it's so independent of us. It can be manipulated through physical means. How can a pill or a hammer be the image of a mental process? That's the holdback. I think that's the source of the intuitive implausibility of idealism in our current cultural context. I don't think that's an objective argument at all. I think it's just knee-jerk intuition, but knee-jerk intuition dominates cultures, have always dominated culture. We are no different.
I think it's also misplaced intuition because they're pointing to qualities to justify a world outside of qualities. But anyways.
Dave once, I published a paper, I think it was 2017, with answers to the common criticisms against idealism. It was in a journal called the Disputatio. It was an academic journal, and it was, a blind peer review, as it has to be. But there was one reviewer who was really, making me run the gauntlet. Ultimately, he accepted the paper. The paper was published. I made several additions, improvements to the arguments. He really put me through the gauntlet. And afterwards, Dave told me, that guy who put you through the gauntlet, that was me. So yeah, we have had a sort of peer review exchange in which he checked whether my response to the criticisms against idealism held water. Ultimately, he did accept the paper, which doesn't mean that his opinion is that my arguments were convincing. That's not how you review an academic paper. You have to check whether the argument is coherent and well-founded. It doesn't need to be convincing to you personally. So I don't think that convinced him, but it did give him the chance to point out at least the more objective protests or counter-arguments against analytic idealism.
I'll move it over to Jack now.
Thanks, man. I got a question from Eat My Possum. He asks, maybe Too personal a question, but in your words, you're starting living your ontology. How do you navigate such a shift in worldview with a partner?
With my personal partner, my partner, she's an artist. She's not a philosopher. She's not tied to conceptual thinking at all. She's an intuitive person. A lot of what I say for her is like absolutely redundant. It's like, why do you even need to say this stuff? Isn't this our lived experience? Isn't that sort of obvious? And if I sort of frame it in conceptual terms to her, then she acknowledges, yeah, if you put it this way, then we have to discuss. But she doesn't go there. I don't need to put it that way for her, if you know what I mean. So it's like skating on thick ice. It's no problem. We just slide along together. There is no conflict whatsoever, because for her, it's like, why do I even need to bother? When I wrote a book, that book called More Than Allegory, it was largely inspired in her attitude towards the world, towards religion, towards transcendence. So it was a way to codify a lived intuition. Of course, I started from a very different place. I'm extreme rationalist. The intellect dominates me, still does. Less now. I'm open to my other mental factions now more than ever before in my life. But the intellect is still the dominant faculty. So for me, it was a struggle. For her, it's a completely different story. And of course, we give reassurance to one another, because I give her reassurance that she doesn't need to be a clever debater in order to validate the way she lives her life. I give her that validation from the outside, and she gives me validation from the side of the intuitive, directly felt qualities of life.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Question from Syllogism. He asks, if a biological system that metabolizes is the image of a dissociation, does this also imply that every cell that constitutes our body is an alter? Would it make sense to say that we are a composite of alters or their interactions?
This is one of the best questions. There is one thing that our cells share and can be objectively measured, and that's DNA. They all share largely the same DNA. They also, in their behavior, work in a highly orchestrated way. There are exceptions to this. There are certain conditions, genetic conditions, in which your cells do not work in an orchestrated way. Cancer is when your cells do not work in an orchestrated way. Their DNA mutates and changes. But beyond those irregular situations, when life is on its regular mode, our cells do not behave like dissociated independent organisms. They behave like a unified orchestra. And then you might say, well, but they are still different cells. Why do we say that? Why do we insist on that separation? Because there is a cell membrane separating some fluid in different sacs. It is one organism. The seeming boundaries that we perceive on the screen of perception, in other words, the stuff we see under a microscope, those boundaries reflect, the pixels of the screen of perception. They do not necessarily imply boundaries in the thing that appears on the screen of perception. The image of Jack appears on my screen now like a pixelated two-dimensional image. I can't say I can see the pixels because I'm using a retina display right now, but 20 years ago, I would have seen him pixelated. And I would say, well, Jack is composed of little discrete rectangles and two-dimensional. Well, is that what Jack is, a collection of rectangles? Of course not. Jack, the structure of the screen, of the representation, is not necessarily the structure of the thing represented. When a subject is represented on the screen of perception, you see cells, but the boundaries and the structure of cells are not necessarily the structure of the thing represented as cells. In other words, the subject, the dissociated alter. The structure of the alter's image on the screen of perception is not necessarily the structure of the alter itself. And that's one thing to keep in mind. If we look at behavior as opposed to just images, or no, microscopic images, if we look at behavior, our cells certainly do not behave as independent segments of the organism. There is only one organism. When they start behaving as independent segments, you call it cancer, and it can kill you. So I don't think that the membrane of cells implies or even suggests in any vaguely compelling way that the alter is constituted of myriad tiny individual subjectivities. I don't think that is the case at all.
Thank you. I hope he answered your question fulfillingly. Syllogism. I got one from Johnny Boy. He says, or Johnny B01, can you see there being any way to use category theory, set theory, model theory, complexity theory, and other fields with similar perspectives and shared goals to create a mathematical basis for analytic idealism? Maybe the same thing like Donald is doing, I guess.
It's a valid exercise. From my own perspective, I have said this many times, and this is important to me to get this point across. Analytic idealism is not a new physics of nature. It doesn't replace science. It provides a ontological framework for us to interpret science, but it is not a predictive model of nature like scientific theories. In other words, you can say that certain empirical evidence contradicts certain ontologies, insofar as the ontology requires nature to behave in a different way that it does. So from that perspective, empirical evidence is important to judge between different ontological alternatives. But ontologies are not predictive theories of nature that can be directly falsified by experimentation in such a way that the question of ontology is settled. That can only be done when you have a scientific theory. In other words, when you predict nature's behavior. If you say, if I drop this ball, it will fall upwards, and you drop the ball and it falls downwards, then your theory is wrong. You're done with it. Or if you, I mean, there have been so many theories. If you say, like Peter Higgs did, that within a certain energy range, we should detect a particle that corresponds to the Higgs field that explains inertia or mass. And then you run the experiment, like we did that, starting from the 90s all the way into 2012. And you collect the data and you find it there. There is an energy bump exactly in the range where Peter Higgs predicted it. Then the Higgs boson is a scientifically valid theory. But these are all predictions about nature's behavior. They are agnostic of what nature is. Like, what is the Higgs boson? We don't know. We just know that nature behaves in such a way that this pattern of behavior we call a Higgs boson, a bump in an energy histogram, happens. So I don't feel the need to mathematically instrumentalize analytic idealism as if it were a theory, a predictive theory of behavior. It's not. It's a rational hypothesis about what nature is. It's about esse, not behavior. It's about being, not behavior. And yes, you can discard certain ontologies based on empirical evidence if the empirical evidence contradicts what the ontology says, but that doesn't make ontologies scientific theories. So I don't think you will see me instrumentalizing analytic idealism idealism to predict the behavior of nature. What Donald is doing, I think, is a valid exercise. It's not an exercise that I myself feel the need to do. Having said that, I think that all the different fields of investigation that you've mentioned, particularly complexity theory, can be useful in elaborating on analytic idealism, because analytic idealism is probably the most reductive theory of what nature is that has ever been proposed. It cannot be more reductive than that, because what it says is the one ontological category we are directly acquainted with, mind, that is the only thing that exists. There is nothing else. Everything can be reduced to that one mind of nature, that one field of subjectivity that underlies all of nature. You don't get more reductive than this. It's an extraordinarily reductive view of nature, and therefore it faces the challenge of having to make sense of all the variety of observations in terms of one thing alone, one mind with its natural archetypes. In other words, with its mental properties. And to bridge the gap between the boundless variety and diversity of natural phenomena and natural entities, to make sense of all that in terms of this one thing is a challenge. And I think complexity science helps us do that, because it shows that infinitely diverse behavior can and does arise from extremely simple rules. In other words, from a small set of archetypes. We know that, for instance, from cellular automata. Extraordinarily simple rules can lead to computationally irreducible behavior. In other words, stuff that is so diverse, so complex, so varied, that you can't predict what the cellular automata will do in the future in any other way other than to let it run and arrive at the future. And then you see what it did. So yes, these sciences can help. Analytic idealism can help bring plausibility to it, but I don't feel the need to instrumentalize analytic idealism as if it were a predictive theory of nature's behavior. It's not a science, it's an ontology.
Thank you. I'm gonna pass it back to Robin. One thing though, I don't know why this is happening and why is this happening now, but my Zoom is giving me a message that I should register and that we have about 3.5 minutes left before it's gonna end the meeting. And well, all right. I think he's just dropped in. There you are.
I'm back.
I'm back. Okay, I think I got unlimited minutes now, so I think we're good. Ramen, can you hear Kastrup, Bernardo?
Yeah, welcome back.
Okay, cool. Then I'm gonna just pass it over to Ramen and forget this ever happened. Thank you for your patience.
So I have a question from Jordan Ness, and they ask, both good and evil spiritual beings are talked about in various religions. In Christianity, angels and demons are considered to be literally real, and people claim to have interacted with them. In psychedelic trances, people encounter various forms of these good and evil entities, interacting with them as if they were real conscious beings. Do you think these entities have a private inner life? Is it something that it is like to be an angel or a demon or a DMT jester? Or are they a kind of anthropomorphized mental symbolism or archetype?
I think both, because I don't know exactly what people mean when they say, do you think that angel or that demon? I don't know what they are referring to. I think in a psychedelic experience, a lot of what you see is your own projections. It's aspects of your own mind, your own fantasies. You can punch through all that. You can punch through your own stuff and get to ineffable space in the mind, the place in the mind that we cannot say anything about. That is possible. Very few people who did psychedelics actually go there, because it requires a certain kind of trust, because to get there, your ego it dissolves into vapor. You are gone. It's not the person, it's not the human that arrives there. There is a metaphor in the Bible, and to get to the kingdom, you have to pass through the eye of a needle, the little hole of a needle. And that's the metaphor for you have to abandon, leave everything behind, because you cannot carry that stuff with you there. You don't get there carrying that stuff. And that stuff includes your whole understanding of what you are as a human, a person, and all the categories in terms of which you try to make sense of your existence. All of that's gone. And it's a tough journey to get there. So most people don't go there. If you do arrive there, and then you see what we could call, in this terrible language we have, an entity, could that have an inner life of its own? Probably. But I think what most people see in their dreams, in their hallucinations, in their fantasies, in their psychedelic trips, is just their own stuff. There is nothing it's like to be those images. Those are projections of one's own mind. They don't have an inner life of their own. But I do not discard the possibility that in this, unlimited field of mentation that underlies nature, that there can be non-human alters that do not have a representation on the screen of perception. In other words, it's stuff you can't see, you can't touch, you can't smell. You can only become acquainted with if you tune in into another bandwidth of the excitations of mind, another frequency in the excitations of mind, in order to resonate with the space where those things exist because of their own nature, and then pick up a signal that may correspond to them. I think that is not incoherent. I think it's just enormously speculative. And we do not have, I think, good reasons to elevate this within our culture to the status of a fact. We do not have that. What we have are the disparate reports of brave journey people who at different times, under different circumstances, have gone to strange lands and returned with tales. And there is enough of that to entertain seriously the possibility that those tales might correspond to something real. In other words, not to self-made projections, but to something that has an inner life of its own. I think we have enough to entertain that possibility. Yeah, not enough to say it is a fact.
I have a pretty technical question about psychedelic studies, so please forgive my ignorance on this. So you cited a paper titled Two-Dose Investigation of the 5-HT Agonist Psilocybin on Relative and Global CBF. And the authors conclude that there's increases in relative CBF, but overall decreases in global CBF. Can you explain what that means?
Was that the Carhart-Harris 2012 paper? I think it was. Proceedings of the National Academy.
No, it was Candice R. Lewis.
Was that from Zurich? 2017?
I'm not terribly sure about the date. Yeah, 2017, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's the Swiss guys. With CBF is cerebral blood flow, and that is a proxy for brain activity. It's not a direct measurement of brain activity. What you measure is cerebral blood flow in the brain. But it's extremely reasonable to say that to have more activity, you need more blood, because blood is the fuel of activity. And if you have less fuel, then you have less activity because there is no fuel to burn. The brain works based on a metabolic process, an oxidation process, burning, essentially, that requires oxygen that is in the blood. That's the fuel. all papers that have looked at this have concluded that cerebral blood flow reduces in all parts of the brain. No, I'm wrong. Cerebral blood flow only reduces. It may reduce more or less in different parts of the brain, but psychedelics do not increase CBF. They only reduce CBF, not uniformly, not across the brain in the same dose, in the same way, but they only reduce. Wherever they have an impact, that impact is a reduction. There is no increase in cerebral blood flow anywhere compared to the placebo baseline. In other words, compared to our ordinary state of consciousness. So that's the first conclusion. Once you have accepted that, now we can drill down. In the brain activity that is left, it's much reduced, but it's not zero. Your brain doesn't die under psychedelics, luckily. That's why psychedelics are safe. Within the activity that still remains, the residual activity, how can you relate the relative degree of activity between two different brain regions? That is the relative CBF between different brain regions. So let me give you an example with numbers so it becomes concrete. Suppose that the relationship between your prefrontal cortex and your prefrontal cortex parietal lobe, their level of brain activity before psychedelics, let's say it's 8 and 10. So prefrontal cortex level 10, parietal lobe level 8. And then you take the psychedelic and then both reduce. Let's say the prefrontal cortex goes from 10 to 6 and the parietal lobe from 8 to 7. Both reduced, but within the context of the reduced activity, the parietal lobe is now more active than the prefrontal cortex. It doesn't mean that it's more active than it was before the psychedelic. No, it went from 8 to 7. But the prefrontal cortex went from 10 to 6. So now the parietal lobe has more activity than the prefrontal cortex. That's a relative increase in activity in the parietal lobe compared to the prefrontal cortex. But both were reduced in activity by the psychedelic. You see what I mean? So we have to be careful with these words. Now, a relative increase, and people go, oh, there is an increase. Psychedelics increase brain activity. And this happened. Paper showing that there was an increase in functional connectivity between different brain regions. In other words, they got less active, but the residual activity, the activity that did remain, was more correlated across different brain regions. And then the press goes and says, oh, increased, psychedelics increase your brain activity. That happened in 2016, and it was never corrected by the authors of the paper. So you have to be careful with this stuff. The Swiss paper from 2017 shows that, comparing activity in any brain region to the activity of that same brain region before the psychedelics only decrease brain activity.
Wow, that's pretty misleading. I don't know why they frame it like that.
Well, I'll be very honest with you. I don't think the Swiss paper is misleading. I have seen misleading articles. They tend not to be technical literature. I have seen not only misleading articles, but flat out lies written by the same authors of the technical article. The technical article is accurate because it's technical. And the popular write-up written in a blog or something, it completely misportrays to the point of flat out lying, in my view. So that is a danger. But the technical papers themselves, they tend to be very objective, very straightforward, accurate. I wouldn't censure that. I'll give you an example of a misleading claim that was not in the technical paper. There was a paper 2014, and the study was on psychedelics again by the same team that had studied psychedelics before. And instead of looking at brain activity, how active is your brain before and after psychedelics, they looked at brain activity variability. In other words, how much does your brain activity vary from moment to moment when you are under psychedelics compared to when you are not under psychedelics? So let's say that when you are not under psychedelics, your brain activity varies between 9 and 10. It's always between 9 and 10. And then you take psychedelics and your brain activity goes down to between 2 and 4. So it's much lower, but the variability is higher. Between 2 and 4, there are 2 units. Between 9 and 10, there is 1 unit. So psychedelics increase brain activity variability. And why was the study about this? Well, technically, it was based on a Fourier analysis to determine the spectrum of activity across different frequencies. And in that spectrum analysis, the phase information about the different frequency components is discarded. So you have no idea what the amplitude of the signal is. All you can determine is the variability of the signal. So that study has found that with psychedelics, the variability of whatever brain activity is left increases. And then one of the authors wrote a popular article saying brain activity increases. And I referred to his own paper. He was the second author. I referred to his own paper and I said, that is not what the paper is saying. And that was back in 2014. And we brought in the lead author of the paper who had actually done the signal analysis, which is sort of a specialization in its own right. I know it because I did engineering. Signal processing is part of engineering. And the first author said, Bernardo, you're correct. Our paper says nothing about the absolute values of brain activity, it only talks about variability. And then I questioned this second author and I said, okay, so your write-up, your interviews given to major journals like, the Washington Post and CNN, you said wrong things in your interview. Do you plan to correct them? And he said, no, I will not correct them because brain activity is a very ambiguous term. And in one case, what I mean by activity is actual activity. And in the other case, what I mean by activity is activity variability. I mean, this is at the very least gratuitously misleading. It's an unethical attempt to save face. I think he committed an honest error. He did not understand the signal processing analysis done in his own paper because it was not done by him. And once it was pointed out to him, he did not want to correct himself. To this day, you can go to CNN, to the Washington Post, to other places in which there is a quote from this researcher, who is now the leader of the department, basically saying something untrue about his own research and hiding behind the idea that, well, brain activity and activity variability, it's all activity. No, it's not the same thing for the same reason, the exact same reason. That speed is not the same thing as acceleration. They are related, but they are not the same thing. You don't say when you're driving at 200 kilometers an hour stable speed that you are accelerating. You're not. But you may be in a moped going from 20 to 40 kilometers an hour. And now you have high acceleration, but not high speed. These are not different. These are not the same thing. So you see this in the popular write-ups and interview. I haven't seen it yet in a technical paper. Heads would roll if it was done in a technical paper.
I'm gonna move on to another question. It's from L66K. That is, what is it that determines an alter's unique point of view? Why am I me instead of you? Is it by whatever mental contents mind at large has chosen to extricate from itself at any given time, so that certain contents give rise to one POV and others to another? Or are we rather like archetypes ourselves, which makes more sense given... Yeah.
I don't think we are different archetypes. No, I don't think there is any fundamental difference between us whatsoever. And the question started, why am I me and not you? I dispute that premise. You are me and I am you. I am you in another point of space-time, therefore experiencing the world from another perspective, because perspective is determined by a point in space-time. this would make a lot of sense to you if we sort of dropped space and talked only about time. So let me give you an example, a metaphor to try to make this very vivid and clear. When I was a kid, I used to watch my father play chess against himself. He had a dedicated chess table, 2 chairs, and then he would sit on the white side, play a move, then stand up, go around to the other side, sit, think, play a move. And this would go on for the entire game, because back in the late 70s, this is how people studied chess. There were no chess engines and computers, that's how you did it. You literally took the point of view of your opponent to develop the ability to think from your opponent's point of view, which is essential to play chess. You have to think from your opponent's perspective in order to outplay your opponent and predict what your opponent's going to do. So my father did that. Now, there is no question it was the same subject. At one time, that subject was on one side, then that subject went to the other side and played from the other point of view. It's one subject, 2 points of view. And that's trivial because it happens at different moments in time. My father is playing white, then he goes and plays black, takes 2 different points of view. And it's still my father. It's not a different person. It was always my father. What you have to do now is to extrapolate this to space, because we know since Einstein that space-time, they are one thing. They're not 2 different things. So I cannot now stand up and take your point of view, but at the same time as you. But I don't need it because I am in another point of space. And space is like time. You are me. When you see me, you are seeing you playing on the other side of the chess table, except that the other side is now defined purely in spatial terms, concurrent in time, because space and time are one and the same thing. It's the same substrate. It's the same entity. You see what I mean? If you internalize this and you truly understand this, then you will see that you are me, just in a parallel timeline. Imagine that you could time travel and you could go to the past 5 years ago and watch yourself. It would be still yourself, but in another point of space, taking another point of view. But because of your memory, you would know that's me. I remember what that point of view was because I was there in the past and now I'm watching it from the outside. This is what's happening. I am the future you, or the you in another place in space. It doesn't matter because space-time is the same thing. I am you playing chess against you on the other side of the table. After you stood up and went around purely in space and not in time. If you really wrap your head around this, the difficulty of understanding how one subject can be all subjects vanishes, for the same reason that it's not difficult to understand that it was the same subject playing chess on both sides of the table when I watched my father do it. There is nothing spectacular, nothing extraordinary or difficult about it if you can make this jump of understanding space as the same thing as time. Different positions in space is the same thing as different moments in time.
Raman, 1 second. 1 second. I think this is a great answer, and there's something I really like to add to that, or at least ask you. It's a question by Moonseller and me actually. If you're familiar with either or open individualism or distributed solipsism. I don't know if you've heard of the terms. The last one sounds funny, but
people are in love with coming up with words and stuff.
Yeah.
Would
you like me to give a short definition of both?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So distributed solipsism. It's a terminology by Christopher Langen. He says that it's a type of solipsism in which oneself is distributed over all individuals. The soul self is not tied to a single individual, but shared among all individuals and variously experiences the cognition and perception of all of them. And then on the other side, or the same side, you have open individualism, which says that it's the view in the philosophy of self according to which there exists only one numerically identical subject who is everyone at all times.
They are both the same thing, and they are the same thing as analytic idealism. It's just words. Analytic idealism says there is only that which experiences, TWE. That's the subject behind all the solipsistic points of view. And it is the distributed subject. I mean, it's just words. It's just words. We are not talking about different things here.
No, that's not the feeling I got. I think if you take solipsism truly seriously, then that's not really saying anything else. Then you are saying that there's one subject, and that is.
Well, that's not what is traditionally meant by solipsism.
I know, but it's like some people take it more seriously. It's like, okay, we take this term solipsism more serious than the people who use it to discredit the idea. Let's say. But that's how it feels to me if I hear these two terms.
The spirit of solipsism is that the other people do not have their own inner lives. Everything exists only insofar as the images you experience yourself. They do not have their own point of view. That's the spirit of solipsism. If you say that, it's another version of solipsism to say that, no, they actually have their own point of view. It's just that it's the same subject. Well, you're playing with words. That's not what solipsism is.
Know what I mean? Fine. No, that's fine. Okay. It's fine. Sorry, Raman. Go on. I interrupted you.
No problem. I think it's a pretty terrifying idea that I'm every creature that ever existed.
Yep, it is extremely terrifying. It's the vertigo of eternity. It's a place where...
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
It's a place where most people will instantly recoil from if they get a glimpse at it.
Yeah. I have a question from Velvet, and they're a person, I think, that's suffering from DID. And they ask, the barriers between myself and fundamental consciousness that corroded away during psychedelic trips and led me to self-realization, enlightenment, feel the same as the barriers between my alters and subsystems within my polyfragmented system. What explanation could one consider for how fundamental consciousness became fragmented when the barriers within my manifested consciousness were created by trauma?
Dissociation happens in humans almost invariably as a consequence of trauma. When an experience is just too overwhelming to be integrated, so it needs to be cut up in pieces and compartmentalized, so it's never experienced as a whole. And this is a sort of internal protection building within one mind to protect itself from itself. That doesn't mean that the same has to be the mechanism that led to dissociation in nature at large, and therefore to the origin of life. That would be to carry the metaphor perhaps too far. I'm not saying that that's not the case. I am saying it's not necessarily the case. You could regard dissociation as something that, given enough time, more time than it would take a human life is, we are like mayflies. We are dead before we even know we are born. But in the lifetime of the universe, in the lifetime of existence, given enough time, within our conception of time, you could say dissociation is bound to happen. Not because of trauma that induces it, but because it's one of the potentialities of nature. It's one of the things that can happen in nature. And if you give it enough time, it will happen. For the same reason that stars go supernova, volcanoes erupt, and that it hails in the summer. It's stuff that happens in nature. Given enough time, it's bound to happen. So that's one explanation. Now, that doesn't refute the alternative, which is the intuition of the person who asked the question, that nature underwent some form of trauma. It is not incoherent to think of that a form of trauma probably related to the vertigo of eternity, of that sudden, very temporary, very random, but sudden access to metacognition, despite the lack of the structures that can sustain metacognition. I think that's something that only evolution has given us. It's not part of nature in the beginning. But to speak the language of physics, quantum fluctuations could have been such that there was a metacognitive glimpse of self-identity in the mind of nature at some point, that it was just instinctive, doing what it does because it is what it is, and then suddenly, I am me, and I am alone. Oh, that one moment could have been the trauma that gave birth to life, to that dissociation. And that's coherent in the sense that it would alleviate the trauma immediately, because it would create the appearance of company, of multiple individuals, multiple things going on, or at least a separation between the inside and the outside. So now you're alone, but at least you are not the whole thing. There is a world to be explored. You are alone, but there are things that are not you. This is all fun speculation, and mythology has addressed this, especially Indian mythology. The Vedas, not the Upanishads, the original Vedas, the real mythological part of Indian philosophy, touches on this when it talks about, Brahman planting his seed in the sea and then giving birth to itself within its own creation. There are South American myths that talk about this as well. There's an Amazonian tribe that says that the world was created when Nainema, a deity, bound his dream and then stepped on his dream, stamped on it until he entered his own dream. That's dissociation. And the stamping is sort of an energetic reaction that you could, compare to the reaction to trauma, and a very energetic reaction to something, an instinctive response to something. So it's fun to entertain all this. But if you put me against the wall with a gun on my head and saying, if you had to make a bet, why did life arose? Was it trauma of the universal mind? With a gun on my face, if I had to give an answer, my best guess would have been, no. It just happened because it was one of the things that could happen. It was one of the potentialities of nature. Given enough time, it was bound to happen. And guess what? It did. And it would happen to any one of us if we lived 4.5 billion years or 13.8 billion years. We would also undergo spontaneous dissociation without trauma. But we live for 80. We are mayflies. It needs trauma to induce that thing in us.
Yeah, I think we dissociate all the time without trauma, like in dreaming or in ordinary life. So
absolutely,
it's not necessary.
When you forget, you're dissociated. If you can remember it later, your forgetfulness was a dissociation from yourself. But the spirit of the question was DID, severe dissociation. So I calibrated my answer to that. But you are correct. And dissociation is happening all the time.
I have a question from Voidus, and that's it's a bit of a long shot, but have you heard of Andre Gomez Emelson and the Qualia Research Institute?
No, I have not heard about the name of the person. I have not studied anything about the Qualia Research Institute, but somebody has sent me a message, maybe even two people. It appears that the questioner is not the only one trying to bring my attention to that. I think I did look it up at one time. Don't take what I'm about to say as passing judgment, because I just don't know enough to pass judgment. But if I remember correctly, I was not motivated enough to look further. I thought one of these California things, but I didn't have the impression it was a rigorous thing, but I may be completely wrong about that. Maybe I should look again.
So I have a question for myself, and that is, do you think reality is fundamentally absurd? Like it just doesn't fall within the categories of our logic as it is in itself?
Absolutely. I think that's a slum. It's a done deal that it is so, because logic is a confining of mental associations. You say which associations are valid within that set of assumptions. And those assumptions seem to work empirically. given the world that our cognitive apparatus constructs. Let me try to unpack this. The world in which we think we live is a dashboard representation of what is actually out there. And the dashboard is us. It's our cognitive apparatus. It has evolved over the eons to provide us with dials, sensors and dials, to gather sufficient information about the world in the right form to allow us to respond to environmental challenges and survive. So it's something to be taken seriously. You don't take your dial seriously, you will die. For the same reason that if you're flying by instruments and you don't take your dial seriously, you will crash the airplane. So we should take it seriously, but as Don Hoffman says, but not literally. In other words, we should not think that the world is the dashboard. Of course it isn't. The world is a thing measured in order for there to be representations on the dials in the dashboard. So if I call the dashboard our effective world, not what is really out there, but our world, the world of our experience, we are pilots flying by instrument in a plane that has no windows. We don't get to see what is actually out there. All we have is the dashboard. So for all intents and purposes, the dashboard is our world. It's not the sky outside. It's not what is really out there, but it's our reality.
Sorry to interrupt, but I was more like referring to logic and the law of non-contradiction.
I'll get there. Sorry. Yeah. My long-winded response will eventually get there. Sorry about it. I'm making a meal of this point so people understand the framework of the answer I'm about to give. So
gotcha.
Our world is our dashboard. It is our construct. That our logic is empirically successful in our world only means that we are self-consistent beings. We are an internally consistent construction. Our logic is valid in our world because both our world and our logic are our cognitive apparatus. And our cognitive apparatus is internally consistent. Were it not the case, we wouldn't have survived. That's why logic is empirically almost always infallible, not always. And there is a whole world in philosophy exploring when it's not empirically successful. There is a famous discussion from the 70s between two philosophers, multiple papers with the title, "Is Logic Empirical?" Michael Dumas and other people. There are a whole polemic, a whole movie can be made out of that. But most of the times our logic applies empirically. And what I'm saying is that it applies empirically, not because our logic is fundamentally correct and woven into the fabric of reality. No, it applies empirically because it's as much our own cognitive construct as the world we actually experience. In other words, the dashboard. But our logic does not necessarily apply to the sky outside the airplane, to what is really out there. That's uncharted territory. There is very little reason. There are no non-arbitrary reasons to think that the logic, Aristotelian logic, applies to all of nature. Why would it? We know from Agrippa's trilemma, or the Munchausen dilemma as it's called now, that you cannot use logic to prove the validity of logic. That's circular reasoning. So how are you going to prove the validity of logic beyond the logic? You can't, because all you have to do that is logic. And this circularity is a reflection of the fact that both our world and our logic are parts of our own cognitive mechanisms, which is internally consistent. So internally it works, but we cannot say the world as it really is. That ocean of mentation beyond human comprehension that is really out there also works according to logic. Heck, even humans have different alternatives for logics. We have intuitionistic logic created by a Dutchman in the early 20th century. maybe we should promote this fact a little bit more, Jack, so it's better known in the world.
It's also an interesting
Yeah.
subject. Intuition is logic. So please go on.
The Dutch came up with the best logic, all right?
Obviously.
And not that, huh?
Obviously.
Obviously, yeah. No, I'm saying this because the Germans get all the credit for philosophy and the Dutch get the credit for the paintings. But hey, if logic is philosophy, we should get some credit for that too, because that idea originated here. So there are different logics in the world today. Only Aristotelian logic is intuitive for the majority of the population. But even amongst humans, some of us see through its arbitrariness, through its artificial limitations, and then grasp that nature as it actually is in itself probably flows through chains of cognitive associations that are not bound by our logic at all. Why should they? The primary motivator for a cognitive association is not logic. Babies do not know logic, but they make cognitive associations. Cognitive associations are driven by similarities or simultaneity in time or space. These are the two primary drivers. Things are associated if they are similar, or if they are near each other in space, or close to each other in time, like one follows from another. These are the primary drivers for cognitive association. We build the edifice of Aristotelian logic on top of it because it's useful. Aristotelian logic is a good rule of thumb that works empirically in our world, but our world is also our construct. So logic is it's an empirical observation of how the dials on the dashboard move with respect to one another. Maybe if that dial goes up, that other dial goes down, and they never go up together and they never go down together, and that's an axiom of logic. But it's derived from the dashboard, how the dials move with respect to each other. They are not derived from the world outside that is measured in order for the dials to move. The world is fundamentally absurd. Nature is fundamentally absurd. And it's not to its discredit. It's just a human value judgment. There's nothing wrong with absurdity. Absurdity only means it's not logical, and logic is our construct. So to say that nature is absurd is the same thing as to say nature is not bound by our limitations. Of course it isn't. Why would it be? Right?
Thank you. That was beautiful. I'm going to move it over to Jack now.
Thanks, Raman. Right, man. Got another question by ARHA. He asks, if you had to choose a religion, which one would it be? If you absolutely had to.
I have an answer, but I'm weighing I'm weighing how to do that in a way that doesn't backfire or doesn't convey an impression that isn't true. So let me start with the disclaimers, and then I will give you the answer.
Fair enough.
I have profound respect for all of the world's main religions. I think they didn't become main religions arbitrarily. I think they reflect archetypal patterns of our cognition that cannot be captured in logical conceptual terms, so they become mythologized to express themselves. But the fact that these religions became so predominant means that they are true archetypal reflections, true archetypal expressions of intuitive understanding. And they are not just an arbitrary story that somebody just sat and made up. Because there are those arbitrary stories that somebody just sat and made up. They don't become world religions because they don't resonate with the underlying archetypes of our psyche. So the ones that do resonate have become the world's religions. And for that reason, I respect them all, because I think they are expressions of intuitive understandings that are archetypal. Of course, we make a mess of that. We take them literally. We misunderstand it. We make a mess of it afterwards. We go to war based on these different archetypal expressions that are not they are not mutually contradictory at all. We just think that they are because we flatten them into literal stories. So, and amongst the world's religions, all of which I respect profoundly, intellectually, I have profound affinity with the Indian tradition. And that's for obvious reasons. Analytic idealism is a modern dressing of what was known to people in the Indus Valley 3,500 years ago. So that's what comes closest to me intellectually. But what comes closest to me emotionally are the maps of meaning I was given when I was a child, before I was able to filter things out arbitrarily because of conceptual narratives. So they are the ones that rooted themselves in me. They are the ones that speak to the wholeness of my being, not only my intellect. They are the ones that sink into the body. They are not just thoughts in my head. They permeate my being. And that is Christianity. It is our Western inheritance, it's what we have. It is still the ground on which we germinate as people. Despite being in a tremendously secular society as Western Europe has become, when push comes to shove, if you get that diagnosis and you have been secular and agnostic all your life, you get that diagnosis, what you will do is pick up a rosary and pray. Because regardless of what your thoughts and your little conceptual narratives are telling you, that's what the root of your being is going to appeal to, because that's the archetypal foundation of our culture. So if I am feeling vulnerable, or on the contrary, if I'm feeling strong, but with the awareness that my life is not about me, with the awareness that life is a form of service, it's sacred in the sense that it's service, then I will go to Christian symbology. They speak to me in the most holistic way. They are the ones that, to put it in a bad way, but I hope you give me a discount for this. Christian mythology and symbolism is what grabs me by the balls when I am vulnerable. It's what I retreat to when the world falls apart, and it is also what I will seek when I feel compelled to serve. I will speak to nature in the terms of Christian mythology, because those were the maps of meaning that were given to me when I was still receptive. After you grow up in a secular society, you erect the walls and nothing really grabs you by the balls anymore. Nothing lays roots in the core of your being. Everything stays here like clouds in your head. Everything is thought through. Is it logical or not? Does it make sense or not? That's not what counts when you're really vulnerable. When shit is closing in all around you, when you have nowhere to run, or when you feel devotional, which is equally strong, at least for me. That's what you will reach out to, not because you think that's correct in any conceptual way, but because that's what the core of your being will reach out to, because the core of your being is rooted in nature through those maps of meaning that you got from your culture. And maybe not only during your personal lifetime, but if there is a hierarchy of mind underlying the altars, if there is such a thing as a Western complex in the mind of nature, which there might very well be, a certain mode of cognition, then we are rooted in that as Westerners. I don't think, and I'm repeating Jung here, we in the West, because we have become intellectually arrogant to the point of thinking that this monkey intellect of ours that has existed for only 30,000 years, in other words, a blink of an eye ago, that it can capture and understand and judge all salient aspects of nature. I mean, this is ridiculous. Of course it doesn't, but we believe it does. And for that reason, we've dropped religion. Because on the superficial analysis of the intellect, religion taken literally makes no sense. And we lost contact with the very roots of our being. So we think we are not connected to our archetypal roots anymore. Through Christianity, through those maps of meaning, we poo-poo them, we disregard them. And what do we do instead? Every human being needs a connection to the root of meaning. So we go for the exotic alternatives. We go do Buddhist meditation. I'm not saying Buddhist meditation is bad. On the contrary, I think Buddhism has had a critical, positive influence in the West, starting on the 20th century, when we lost our way completely. We became completely disconnected from transcendence. Buddhism came to our rescue. The Indian traditions came to our rescue. Thank goodness they did this. They are our older brothers and sisters, much more ancient civilizations than ours. And they were there ready to, when we fell, to prevent us from hitting our head against the pavement and dying. They were there to hold us. I'm eternally grateful to them for doing that. But that doesn't mean that those are our traditions. People meditate for 30 years without really having a connection with the thing they are seeking. If we would be less arrogant about the power of the intellect and the power of logic and the power of narratives, and put aside what we know is the case when it comes to the institution of the church, all the sex abuse, all the nonsense, the power struggles, all that bullshit, that's the institution. It's not religion. Yes, the institution tries to keep the religion alive, but the institution is a human organization and it's flawed. Keep that in mind. The priest doesn't need to be a perfect human being in order to play the role that he or she needs to play as an actor in an enactment, in the liturgy. The liturgy is not about the actors enacting it. The liturgy is a symbolic enactment to try to help you connect to something deep inside you that is not you. It is really you, but it's not the personal you that you think you are. If we have this understanding, then we can go to church and be truly Christians without needing to support what the church does, without needing to think that the priest is a model human being. We don't need any of that. When you go to church and you attend mass, that's something between you and the divinity. Everything else is just acting. It's a method. It's a technique. It's like you're not taking psychedelics. Instead, you watch liturgy. It's the same purpose. You see what I mean? It's a means to an end. It's not the end. And I despair for the disconnection of secular Europe, Western Europe. In the East, they didn't get there yet. Our disconnection from the roots, the paths to transcendence and meaning. And that's what makes us feel so vulnerable, because, when you lost your own identity, when you lost the vitality of your own archetypal identity and your connection with the transcendent, when you lost that, you become very insecure. And when the Muslims come and build a mosque next to us, we feel threatened. We wouldn't feel threatened if we still had the vitality of our own tradition, of our own paths, of our own symbology, our own identity as a culture. We wouldn't feel threatened. We would welcome them. We would even protect them, give them sanctuary, just like the Muslims gave sanctuary to the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula when they dominated the Iberian Peninsula. When the Christians kicked them away, the Jews got screwed. Spinoza's family had to run away to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, because they wouldn't get killed here, but the Christians would have killed them in the Iberian Peninsula. It was a disaster for the Jews when the Muslims were not in control of the Iberian Peninsula. They gave them sanctuary. Why? Because they had that vitality. They knew who they were. They knew their connection to the transcendence. They were not insecure. The Jews They think differently. They have their own connection. They are not a threat to us. We're not going to lose ourselves because they're worshiping next to us. Of course not. We will protect them. We will give them sanctuary. We would be doing the exact same thing to the Muslims if we had this self-assurance that you have naturally when you are connected to the roots of your own tradition. You don't feel threatened by a minority that you're sheltering. Why would you? But we do, because we lost ourselves. And that's a big problem for us and for our guests too.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a good answer. Great. Well, speaking on the subject of religion, so Amers IDD asks, Bernardo, can you speak more on God as a suffering being? You said that all may not be well. This is speculative territory, but an elaboration would be useful, especially for a closure on the problem of evil.
I don't think there is a problem of evil. The problem of evil arises from a relatively arbitrary assumption, which is that nature, in its most fundamental level, has to be good. But why? Why should it have to be good? Or to put the same thing in different words, the problem of evil arises from the assumption that God has to be intrinsically and purely good, the summum bonum of the New Testament. That God is only good, and all the evil is with the devil, which is a medieval invention. There was no devil at the early ages of Christianity, even into Rome, even into 3rd and 4th, 5th century, even into Augustine. The devil, as we picture it today, is a medieval invention. But there was a devil in the Old Testament. And what was that devil? He was the prosecutor in the court of God. He was the metacognitive aspect of God, the doubter. Because God was purely instinctive. If you read the book of Job in the Old Testament, when the devil doubts Job's righteousness, as the prosecutor, he has to doubt. It's his role. He's a member of the entourage of God. He's not in hell. That's the God of the Old Testament. He's not in hell. He's there alongside God and the angels. He's the firstborn of God, the prince, the favorite son. In other words, he's made of the same stuff as God because he's the son of God. He is an aspect of God. That's what all of this mythology is trying to tell you. And he's doubting, and he doubts Job, and God tests Job. And at some point, Job gets furious and seeks an audience with God to argue, why did you kill my children? Why did you take my money and my farm and everything I had? Why did you make me ill? I have always honored you. I never did anything right. I've followed the law. I'm a righteous person. Why did you do all that? And then God goes on a tirade, goes on a long monologue, a furious monologue, telling Job, who are you to question my actions? I am the power behind the storms. And he goes on. And if you read that, what he's saying is, I act spontaneously, just like nature does. For the same reason that storms come, that volcanoes erupt, I made you suffer. Because I don't think things through. I am spontaneous. I just act. I'm not metacognitive. Only my fallen son, the devil, is. And of course, it's the devil that caused Adam and Eve to fall after the devil himself. Let's use the proper word, Lucifer, the carrier of light. After Lucifer fell, he caused the rest of humanity to fall. Therefore, we became metacognitive. And why did he do that? In order to get the whole of humanity to render a service to his Father. Isn't that obvious? That's Lucifer of the Old Testament, an inherent aspect of God trying to help itself. And that's why the serpent in the garden and the tree with the fruit of the tree of knowledge and the fruit and Adam and Eve being expelled, the fall into metacognition, and all of that being a way God found to help itself become less instinctive, less purely spontaneous, because it causes pain and suffering to itself by acting so spontaneously. And it's trying to rescue itself. And we are the means to that end. Life is sacrificial in that sense. And that's what the Christian tradition is telling us. If we absorb the Christian tradition as a whole, not only the Old Testament. The Old Testament is an evolution of that, in which we tried to, and that's also a fundamental archetypal thing. The figure of the Christ is very archetypal. It's the embodiment of all that is good, all that is love related, as opposed to fear related. The opposite of love is fear, not evil. Anyway, it's a sidetrack. And it was important to bring balance when it arose. This idea of the good of nature and salvation through the figure of the Christ, which is an archetype. It's completely irrelevant whether Jesus actually lived as a man or not, doesn't matter. Christ exists as an archetype. It brought a certain degree of balance. I fear we are losing that balance now, because we have this notion that God has to be the summum bonum, purely good, and that exiles the devil into hell. And it gives energy, and makes that energy dangerous. What you reject and ignore and sever and dissociate from and pretend not to exist or contain and repress, that's what gets the energy. And that's what can come back and bite you in the butt. And we are doing that. We are repressing evil. And when we repress evil, we project evil. Everybody else is evil, not us. The Russians are evil. The Chinese are evil. The Jews are evil. The Muslims are evil. And what do you think the Muslims are saying? The bloody Christians are evil. The Russians are evil, invaded Afghanistan. The Jews are evil, took Palestine from us and tortured the Palestinians to this day. Now, we are all doing that because we repress this evil by pretending that it's not an intrinsic part of nature. And that's how the problem of evil arises. When we pretend that it's not an intrinsic part of nature, we get confused when nature expresses evil. So where did that come from? It's not supposed to happen. Nature is not supposed to be evil or to have evil as one of its intrinsic potentialities. Well, hello, obviously it does. Even before humans were around, predators were going around the earth, killing each other, inflicting incredible pain on each other in order to survive. Otherwise, they themselves would suffer out of starvation. Dying of hunger is one of the most horrific deaths. That's the destiny of whoever would not inflict pain and suffering as a predating animal. It's built into the fabric of nature. In your backyard, ants are cutting up earthworms in pieces while they are wiggling alive and wiggling for their lives. There is no problem of evil. Evil is part of the game. It's one aspect of the game. It's just how things are. It's just it. The problem is when we don't acknowledge that, when we repress it, we give energy to it by repression, and we project it on others. Then it becomes really dangerous. Then we wage wars against each other. We kill each other. Conflict arises. Segregation, racism, fundamentalism, religious wars. This is all a consequence of projecting that which you repress in yourself. It's child play, not in the sense that it's innocent. It's not innocent at all. It's terrible. But it's child's play in the sense that it's incredibly naive. It reflects a degree of immaturity that we must overcome at some point before we extinguish ourselves. When you become an adult, you recognize that the roots of evil are in you, and then you manage it. You say, that evil in me, it has a right to exist. It's part of nature. I'm not going to extirpate it, repress it, because then I don't see it. And when I don't see it, that's when it comes back to bite me. That's when I, a righteous man all my life, turn 40, pick up a gun and kill 15 people in a shopping mall. That's what happens when you don't see and nurture a relationship with the evil in you. When you do nurture that relationship, your evil will be like a bonsai tree. It will grow, it will evolve, but it will be kept small because you're always pruning it. You're always managing it. You give it its right to exist, but under adult supervision, so it doesn't cause harm. You can play evil. Don't force me to enumerate the many ways in which you can play with the evil in you without causing harm to yourself or anybody else. Computer games are one way to do that. You play with the evil in you. People say, oh, computer games are incredibly unhealthy. I don't think they are. I think they give flow to an energy that would cause that 40-year-old righteous guy who never played a computer game to actually pick up a gun and kill 15 people in a shopping mall. And if some serial shooters, mass assassins have played computer games, it's because statistically that's bound to happen. Some people with those tendencies in a society where computer games are widespread will have played computer games. Some of them will be white, some of them will be black, some of them will be Asian, some of them will be tall, some of them will be short, skinny, and fat. Of course, statistically, some of them will be all of those things, including having played games. So I think that's the game. The game is granting evil the right to exist and to express itself under adult supervision so it's harmless, and never repressing it, because that's when the true harm is done, when you repress it and you no longer see it because it's repressed. And that requires a certain maturity for the culture. It requires us to become adults as a society and understand that crime prevention is not about vengeance. It's not about personal responsibility. All this philosophical discussion, if there is no free will, then nobody is responsible for the crimes they commit, so therefore they can't be thrown in jail. It's nonsensical. It's not about responsibility and vengeance. It's about preemption. It's about having a society that works properly. A society needs to have trust built into it to work properly. If some people, for no blame of their own, are such alters that are capable of committing evil and have proven themselves to have that capability, then they need to be contained within society in a way that they don't cause the harm that would lead to a breakdown of trust. We must trust that when we are driving on the highway, the other cars will be driven by people who obey the rules. We must trust that when we do a business transaction, the other party will pay without requiring us to sue. And if we sue, we must trust that the law will be followed during that trial. So trust is everywhere. And if nature is such that statistically some people will act in a way that is incompatible with trust, then we have to contain them, not as a punishment, not as vengeance, but because society needs to run on trust. And so we need to compartmentalize things in such a way that not everything goes to hell for everybody, not everything collapses. So that's why I think people need to be incarcerated. And in the Netherlands, we have a fairly mature system. Jack knows about it. We have this TBS system. When you commit a crime and you're sentenced, the first part of your sentence is about deterrence. So if you stole, then you were sent to jail, say, for a year. And the reason for doing that is to let everybody else know that if they steal, they will lose their freedom for a year. And then that fact goes into their calculations about whether they should commit a crime or not. Even if they are programmed automata and you don't believe in free will, deterrence will add a variable to the calculations of the automaton and will prevent crime. Not completely, but will reduce crime. So in the Netherlands, the first part of the sentence is deterrence. It's not vengeance or punishment, it's deterrence. It's to stop others from doing the same thing by adding a variable to their calculations. The second part is what we call TBS, and that has nothing to do with deterrence anymore. That's not a sentence. That's a psychiatric thing. A team of psychiatrists need to evaluate if you're still a risk to society, if you're still capable of committing crimes. And if they think you are, then you remain in a sort of what they call a TBS clinic, which is not like a prison. Well, you cannot leave it anyway. Anytime you want. There are rules. so your freedom is limited, but that is seen by the law as a form of treatment. And of course, our treatments are very insufficient. They are terrible. But at least in the Netherlands, there is this awareness that from this point on, it's a question of treatment, not of deterrence. And it is never a question of punishment and vengeance. Never. And this is a mature way to deal with evil. And it's a way that's under threat, even in this country, even in the Netherlands. There are voices saying, we cannot be so lenient, we have to crash down hard on crime. And yes, we have to prevent crime, but not at the cost of our maturity. Let's not regress. Sorry for this long answer. It's like a speech now. I'll end it here. I said what I wanted to say.
It's okay. No, it's fine. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, man. It's great. Raman, go ahead, man. I think you have some more questions.
Yeah, here's a question from Magda, and they ask, in one of the interviews you talked about pigs, that they are very intelligent, and I am with you. And I understood that you are against industrial farming, etc. Could you reveal if you're a vegetarian or vegan? I am vegan.
I am largely a vegetarian, meaning that I eat very, very little meat. And when I do eat meat, it's chicken or turkey. Partly for health reasons, part for ethical reasons. Birds like corvids are arguably as intelligent as cats, dogs, and pigs. Well, maybe not pigs, but they're very intelligent. But chickens do not have that sophisticated nervous system. It's cliche, the joke that chickens are stupid. I wouldn't call them stupid, but their nervous system is not evolved to the point that can lead to the same kind of suffering and anxiety as a higher mammal has. It doesn't mean chickens are less important. No, every expression of life is equally important. It only means that the likelihood that we can farm chickens humanely without suffering is much higher. It's much easier to partly industrialize the life of chickens than it is to industrialize the life of pigs. So that's my reason. I buy only vrij uitloop. How do I say this? Free running?
I think free running, yeah.
Yeah, free running chickens. Yeah, chickens that are
free range,
not kept inside a building, that they can roam in grass and in open areas. Pens, they are pens, but they can roam. They can look for worms. They can have a chicken's life. They are not castrated like pigs are. There is only one extremely inhumane thing about chickens when they are made a product, which is that the male chicks are killed in a terrible way. They are thrown into a pipe where they are minced, like minced meat. That's how they die. I think that's unacceptable. Hopefully technology will evolve to an extent that we will be able to know which eggs are male, which eggs are female, and we will dedicate to the male eggs to egg consumption, not let them evolve, certainly not let them hatch, and let only the female chicken's eggs hatch, hopefully to come to that. But in general, my position is that the productization of life is unethical. And when it's done with more evolved nervous systems, like pigs, cows, horses, it's criminal. I think we will get to a point if we survive as a civilization, a couple of 100 years from now, that we will look back at our consumption of meat today and we will be horrified at what we do. We are horrified when Koreans kill and eat a dog, which is puzzling It shows the cultural compartmentalization of our minds. Killing and eating a dog is as bad as killing and eating a pig. There is just no difference. If there is difference, killing and eating a pig is worse because the pig is closer to us. We have transplanted kidneys from pigs into humans, and they work. So close they are to us. We are doing research into trying to get viable pig's hearts to transplant into humans. That close they are to us. And they definitely had a very highly evolved nervous system. They are capable of anxiety, of depression, of stress, pain, of course. So I think the industrialization, the productization of life is criminal. I think it is borderline acceptable that certain types of birds be eaten so long as they have a life in the open air. Vrij uitloop, kip. I think that is borderline acceptable. But hopefully we will develop alternatives even to that.
Well, there's an environmental downside to it. Me personally, I'm hoping for lab-grown meat to fix all of that.
That would be, if it doesn't require tremendous amounts of energy and water, then that would be an alternative. And yes, you're correct. To grow a pound of meat will cost as much as to produce probably hundreds of kilos of grain and other vegetable protein sources. So to grow red meat is now, it's a borderline genocide. Because it's one of the key contributions to climate change. And climate change, the Dutch will survive in one way or the other. We will either float the country and protect Amsterdam, or we will find some other ways. But people in Bangladesh will drown. People in India will drown. In all the tropical areas that are poor and have limited resources, that's genocide. And to industrialize red meat to the extent we have done and are doing, it's genocidal, if you ask me. It's criminal to an extent that is hard to overestimate. It's very hard to overestimate how criminal it is. But culturally, it comes across as, oh, okay, right? It has always been done like this. No, it has not always been done like this. When it was done in the 18th century, there are only a few 100 million of us running around. There are now 7.5 billion, edging on 8, and everybody wants to live like Americans do. Yeah, that's never happened in the history of humanity. No, we cannot do that. We must break away from this cultural notion that I have the right to eat meat. You have no bloody right. Who told you you have that right? You have the right to eat, not to eat what you choose to eat because of your meat addiction or whatever. Anyway.
Not to beat a dead horse, but there's also the with the meat industry, and it's gonna kill us. Antibiotic resistance. We give them so many antibiotics.
There may be that too. Look, all I can share with you very honestly is how I live. Through the months from July into at least March, sometimes April of the next year, we eat vegetables we grow ourselves in our backyard. We have about 60 square meters of intensive farming of vegetables. We eat mostly that. What we buy from the supermarket is rice, salt, olive oil, and the occasional vrij uitloopkip, the occasional free-running chicken and eggs. That's how I live.
I think it was free range. Right, ramen, free range eggs?
Yeah, free range. Yeah, that's
range,
correct. Yeah.
All right, Ram.
All right.
Do you have?
Yeah. I'll move on to another question now.
Okay.
So Eat My Possum asks, we know analytic idealism neatly solves the measurement problem. Do you have similar insights to add to poorly explained physical phenomena like the Big Bang, black holes, dark matter, or energy, or entropy, or otherwise? So what do you think these things may be pointing at?
Um, to be very honest, I don't think analytic idealism solves the measurement problem. There is one aspect of the measurement problem that is still open, which is why does the option that becomes real amongst all the possibilities of nature, when I observe nature, why is that always consistent with the option that becomes real when you observe nature? Why doesn't nature collapse to different realities if different observers interact with it? I think analytic idealism offers a very promising way to make sense of that, and I elaborated on it in a technical paper published in 2016, I think, in the Journal of Philosophy and Cosmology. I tried to go into all the details, explain how it could be tackled. And I think that way is very promising, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that it categorically solves the measurement problem. I think it makes the measurement problem eminently treatable. That would be my claim. It makes the measurement problem eminently treatable, and it dissolves the paradoxes. So two aspects, two things, two claims. It dissolves the paradoxes and makes the measurement problem eminently treatable. But these two together do not mean that I've solved the measurement problem. I personally don't think I did. I think I made it treatable and not paradoxical at all. Now, the Big Bang, we have to keep in mind what the entities in scientific theories are. The Big Bang is an entity, the Higgs boson is an entity, electromagnetic fields are entities. These entities are convenient fictions. You cannot take a magnetic field and say, here it is, here's the field. Nature behaves as though such an invisible thing existed as an electromagnetic field, which acts even in a vacuum. We talk about electromagnetic oscillations, vibrations, like waving. But for there to be waves, something has to wave. There are waves in the ocean because the ocean waves. There are waves in a rope because the rope waves. But what waves in a vacuum? Well, the electromagnetic field. It's a vacuum, but it waves. So you see, these are not concrete entities. These are imaginary theoretical entities carefully sculpted in such a way that we can say nature behaves as though these entities actually exist. And that's all we need to make predictions. Newton postulated this invisible force called gravity that acts instantaneously at a distance between celestial bodies. That's an invisible entity, but we could put a man on the moon using Newton's equations. Does that mean that that entity was real? No. Now we know it's not real. There is no such invisible force acting at a distance, the force of gravity. It's the fabric of space-time that twists and bends. What is the fabric of space-time? It's the next convenient fiction. It's the next thing that nature behaves as though that thing existed. These are models. That's what scientific entities are. They are models, convenient fictions, and they are very important as such because they allow us to predict nature's behavior. Newton's fiction allowed us to put a man on the moon. That's their value. Not that they are really real. No, it's that reality behaves as though they were real. That's all we need. That's all we need to make predictions, to do science, and to develop technology. The fiction of electromagnetic fields allows me to be talking to you right now. Okay, the Big Bang is another one of these fictions. That's what you have to keep in mind. The Big Bang is not an empirical fact. We are not there looking at it happen right now. The Big Bang is an extrapolation. The universe seems to be expanding. The space between celestial bodies seems to be expanding, like you inflate a balloon, a rubber balloon. if we extrapolate it backwards, we get to a singularity, a point of infinite density and no spatial temporal dimensions. That's the singularity, T0 of the Big Bang. We don't even have actual model for that. We have a model until T 1 times 1 times 10 to the power of minus 32. We have a model until that infinitesimal fraction of a second after the Big Bang. All models break down at the moment of the Big Bang itself. So you could say that we have a convenient fiction for 10 to the power of minus 32. And for the Big Bang itself, we don't even have that. We don't even have a convenient fiction. We don't have a model for that. It's an extrapolation. It's fiction. It's fiction that gives us a handle on how to think about the universe's behavior. It may turn out that it's completely wrong. There are people working on the Perimeter Institute in Canada, cutting edge physics being done there. And they think there was no such a thing as the Big Bang. There are alternative theories related to, in the framework of M theory, the collision of hyperbrains. There are all kinds of other things that are being thought through. And the criteria for defining which of these fictions is the best one is the following. Which one of the fictions is such that nature's behavior approaches that fiction the most? In other words, that nature behaves as though that fiction was really, really right. That's what we are trying to find out. We are not trying to find out what actually exists. That's impossible. It's completely impossible. What we are trying to find out is what model gives us a predictive handle on reality. If you understand that this is what the Big Bang is, then in the context of analytic idealism, it doesn't carry that much weight. Life carries weight because life is not a model. We are directly acquainted with it. We are experiencing it right now. So life, a dissociative process, how did that happen? That's weighty stuff under analytic idealism. But remote theoretical abstractions, remote convenient fictions like the universe's heat death or the Big Bang, they are just fictions. They don't carry that much of a philosophical weight. The fictions come and go. Newton's gravity came and went. Now we have Einstein's space-time that is going. Loop quantum gravity is getting rid of that. And before Newton, there was effluvium, this invisible substance, that elastic substance that you couldn't see or feel and you couldn't cut, and it was supposed to connect bodies. And that was meant to explain why shaft got attracted to an amber rod if you electrified that amber rod. Before people knew about electromagnetism, they had to come up with other convenient fictions to explain electromagnetic attraction. So effluvium was one of those convenient fictions. We keep on having these convenient fictions. The only empirical fact of nature is the laws of physics as they manifest now to our observation now. They are not remote. Bodies fall to the ground now. It's not remote. Quantum observations are puzzling now. They're not remote. We carry those experiments daily in laboratories. Life is not remote. We are it. These are the weighty things that need to find a grounding and a place within the context of analytic idealism and may even inspire certain postulates of analytic idealism. But remote convenient fictions, I'm less hot about those. If you forced me to say something about the Big Bang, then I would go to the more mythological aspect of things, which I explored in More Than Allegory. And I would say the Big Bang is a symbol for what's happening right now. What's happening right now is that everything is being created out of nothing, not an ontological nothing, but a no thing. Everything is being created out of no thing right now, and right now, and right now. In other words, the Big Bang is happening right now. And that Big Bang far in the past, 13.8 billion years ago, that's a symbol for what's happening right now, at all times. That's as far as you bring me on that.
I wanted to ask, how are you doing on time? keep you too long.
Are there many questions still?
Yeah.
How long more do you want to go? I haven't had dinner yet and I need to go to the toilet. So if we want to go for another half hour, I'm okay. But you need to give me a 1 minute break.
Take a break.
Another half hour? Okay, I'll be right back.
Perfect, we'll wait.
I'm back.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. Okay.
I'm going to ask a question from Technologenesis. That is, are our memories integrated into the universal mind when we die and our dissociative processes cease, or are they forgotten? If they're remembered, is there a corresponding physical image of the process that maintains the structure of our memories?
Let me start from the beginning of the question. Are our memories preserved at the end of dissociation? Yes, I think they are. Why do I think so? Because I think losing memory is dissociation. Memory is not some, we have this naive metaphor that memories are like computer files stored in some kind of micro SD card inside our heads. It's the metaphor of the time. Before, people had other metaphors, the abacus and mechanical apparatus. These metaphors change and they are all limited. I think the reality of the situation is that what happens is forgetting. Memory doesn't happen. Memory is the absence of the forgetting. In other words, having memories is the absence of the dissociative mechanism. Mind is by nature associated. That's what cognition is. Cognition is a web of associations. And if you have an associative path to reach any content of mind, then that's what we call memory. Memory is the ability to follow a path of associations in order to get the content of memory. So if you say, remember that guy at school at some point in time. So the words of this person get associated with a certain meaning. That meaning gets associated with a recall of images from the past, which gets associated to the content of the memory that you're trying to recall. If you have this entire associative path, you have absolute memory. To not have absolute memory requires breaking these associative links. And that's what we call forgetting. It's usually a temporary process. But the more things are lost in the mists of the path, of the past, the easier it is for these associative links to break. If dissociation ends, then by definition, what remains is memory. It's the entire associative tree. So yes, I think from a theoretical perspective, it's very likely to think that memories are never lost, because there's nothing to be lost. What you lose is the ability to access it through a certain cognitive pathway. You may lose that pathway. The memory itself is a content of mind. Where are contents of mind going to go? Mind is all that exists. Where are they going to disappear into? The notion of memory as being lost is fundamentally based on the intuition of physicalism. If memories are an epiphenomenon of the brain, when those brain structures dissolve, then you actually lose the information. But if everything is mind, contents of mind are what there is. What you lose is the ability to access certain contents of mind from a certain center of awareness. And those centers of awareness arise as a product of dissociation, and therefore the loss of memory is dissociation. When the dissociation ends, there is no loss of memory. You're back to what exists, to what there is. And empirically, this is suggested by what NDEers call the life review, that their entire lives, in every single detail, flashes back to them. It is also empirically suggested by an extraordinarily interesting phenomenon called terminal lucidity, which is even people with advanced Alzheimer's, with their brain decimated, their connective pathways decimated, sometimes right before dying, they become absolutely lucid again. They remember everything, and then they die, which suggests that what you lose is access to memory, not the memories. It's your ability to navigate a associative pathway, a path in a linked graph, to use the metaphor of graph theory. You may lose the ability to access the memory through certain pathways because those associative links may unbind, only later to reform. I don't know whether I answered the entire question, but at least I answered the memory part. There was a second aspect to the question. Can you repeat the second part of the question?
I think Roman went to the back.
Sure.
There he is.
I'm back. Yeah. Is there a corresponding physical image of the process that maintains the structure of our memories?
I think there surely is a physical correlate for memory pathways, access pathways. We know that if you screw up with the thalamus, you can't access your memories. So something about the thalamus, or let me phrase it in a more accurate way. What we call the thalamus is part of the image of mental memory accessing. The pathways to access a certain memory content have an image. The thalamus is part of that image. There are other brain structures involved in that. There is some confusion in neuroscience because people, although there is awareness of this for the past 10 years or so, people still mix up memory access with reportability. These are different things. Reportability requires metacognition. It requires not only that you remember, but that you know that you remember. And some of the studies find physical correlates of memory that are in fact physical correlates of metacognition, back and forth communication between different brain areas. So it sort of makes the water less crystal clear because we are still conceptually mixing up different things in neuroscience. Neuroscience is well known for conceptual confusion, by the way. It's one of our youngest sciences. It has not sorted out the basics yet. It's still in the stage of just cataloging data and incurring all kinds of conceptual confusions. So we have to be patient with neuroscience. It's going to get better. It's very young. It's still on its, britches. So note of tolerance for that. But I'm sure it's an empirical fact, despite the young age of neuroscience, that there are measurable physical correlates of memory access, not of memories themselves. We have no idea under the physicalist metaphor in which we see memories as some kind of computer file stored somewhere in the brain. We have found nothing along those lines. And many papers have been published claiming that they found it, and all of them contradict one another. It's a mess. And if you read them, you realize that it has nothing to do with the claim in the title or the claim in the press release. It's a jungle right now when it comes to memory research in neuroscience. But we can safely state that memory pathways have a physical correlate. In other words, those associative pathways look like something when represented on the dashboard of perception. And the thalamus is part of that image, is part of that representation. We know that because when we screw up with certain brain areas, poof, you cannot access your memories anymore.
The fact that terminal lucidity exists and the fact that you can cut off the heads of planaria and they still remember makes me think that memory may not have an image. Not memory access, memory storage. But
you're probably correct. Yeah.
I'll let Riley ask a question now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Perfect.
Yeah. All right, this is actually a good follow-up to the last question, but in your book, The Brief Peaks Beyond, you kind of speak to a layer of reality during these entities' experience, such as the life review, as you mentioned. And also in your essay submitted to the Bigelow Institute, you speak to past life experiences in children and things like that being based on certain experiences being more sticky. Do you think this requires another layer or assumption to a non-metacognitive field of experience, or do you think it works fine within the scope of current analytical idealism?
I think it works fine. And the reason is the following. When I claim that mind at large, in other words, the parts or the segments or the aspects of universal consciousness that are not enveloped within a local dissociative boundary, in other words, the mind of the universe apart from the minds of living beings. I call it mind at large. When I talk about mind at large being or not being metacognitive, the implication of that is that mind at large in and of itself does not have the ability to create metacognitive insights, metacognitive experiences. They cannot be generated out of mind at large itself. But if you are a metacognitive being, as you are, and you develop a whole collection, a whole host of metacognitive insights during your life, because your alter has the ability to develop these metacognitive insights, due to evolution, you have that ability and you create those insights because you have that ability during your life, and then you die. Those contents of mind that are already created or have been created by an alter are now available to mind at large. And they are still metacognitive, but they were not created by mind at large. They were created by an alter, which then came to an end and contributed those insights to mind at large. From there, they can be captured by a new alter again. And that will be translated as a metacognitive memory of a part life or a past life. That doesn't mean that mind at large was metacognitive. It means that the no longer existing alter that generated that memory or that insight or that mental content was metacognitive and could then generate those before contributing it to mind at large. Do you see the subtle difference?
Yeah, I think so, at least.
So to say that mind at large is not metacognitive, it means only that it cannot develop or generate its own metacognitive mental contents. But if it inherits mental contents from an alter, then those mental contents remain metacognitive after being inherited. And yet mind at large will not be able to generate new metacognitive mental contents. It's restricted to what it inherits. And that's what makes life meaningful. That's our contribution to nature, our unique contribution to nature. Jung wrote extensively about this using the language that life is sacrificial. And actually, this is what underlies Christianity. We've forgotten that, but the idea of life as service comes from the very early days, the very inception of Christianity. Jesus served his Father. So did Lucifer, by the way. All kinds of conspiracy theorists will say that I'm a devil worshiper right now. Anyway.
All right, thank you. Riley, do you have any follow-up questions to that, or are you satisfied?
Well, thank you very much appreciated.
Thank you for your question, man. All right, we have about, 10 minutes left. That is about one answer from Bernardo. So what do you want me to do, Bernardo? Ask you a simple question or elaborate question?
It's up to you guys.
It's up to me. Fine. I was just gonna something really random, something more personal, maybe. So what do you live in the Netherlands? So what are some of your favorite Dutch things, like food, customs, words? I mean, I'm curious as a Dutch person myself.
My favorite Dutch word right now is a verschijningsvorm.
It's a nice one.
Which, if you break it down into the different roots, you would translate that as appearance, but it's much more than appearance, because you explain the mechanism behind it. It's not just a word. There is an explanation built into it.
Well, it's more like appearance form or appearance shape.
A form of appearance. Which is more than just to say appearance. Because appearance can be interpreted as an illusion. No, it's just an appearance. And verschijningsvorm there's a mechanism built into that. Hans Boekstra, the director from several VPRO programs, he's the one that gave me that word. He was interviewing me a couple of years ago. It was in Dutch. And he noticed that at some point I was grasping for the right word. And then he said, verschijningsvorm. And I was like, yes, That's the perfect word across all languages. This is the word, you know. If you get exposed to several languages in your life, you have this fantasy about the ideal language. Certain words will come from Italian, from Portuguese, from French, from German, from Dutch, and you will build the super language in which the words are just perfect for that language. The right language for each word. So yeah, Verschijningsvorm is my favorite right now. I love the Dutch judicial system. Now for Dutch people, I will sound quite Christian now with or conservative with what I'm going to say, but let me preface that by saying that I voted GroenLinks the last municipal election, but I appreciate enormously the Dutch norms and values, normen and waarden. It was the first country for me in which I didn't feel any need to adapt. The values and customs and norms as they are natural here were just mine. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need to manage my behavior and how people would perceive me. In Switzerland, I had to do that. In my birth country, I had to do that throughout my youth. I didn't know that I was doing that, but you know, that my childhood time in Brazil was a constant, desperate effort to fit into something that wasn't mine. And I didn't know that it wasn't mine. It had to be mine, right? I was bloody born here. But as a child, you don't have this. You just feel the pressure. And the normen and waarden, the norms, customs. The norms, customs, and values of Dutch society resonate with me very much, which give me some anxiety when I feel they are threatened. I am a funny mix between progressive liberal and extreme conservatist. I'm conservative in some aspects. I'm extremely liberal and progressive in others. I will be the first one to tell you gay or trans or LGBTQ plus rights are not novelty. They're just human rights. I think even separating that in words does a disservice to it. We're talking about human rights, the rights to be who you are and the rights to love who you love. If you don't have those rights, what human rights are left? If you don't have the right to be who you are, what rights do you have then? And at the same time, I'll be the first one to tell you that norms and values and customs are our roots to our identity. It's what will give us solid ground to walk on and will dissipate our insecurities. They are the antidote to the banalization of life that a liberal approach without checks and balances leads to. Everything becomes meaningless. Everything becomes banal. It's what Milan Kundera described as the unbearable lightness of being. Everything becomes so light, so airy, that it's unbearable. Nothing has essence, nothing has value, nothing has weight, nothing has continuity, nothing has character, root, identity. Nothing's archetypal. Everything vanishes into some kind of airy, ghostly make-believe system. So yeah, the values I most attached to are traditional Dutch values.
And food? What about food? My girlfriend specifically asked me to ask you what do you prefer, poffertjes or pancakes?
Poffertjes.
For the people listening.
No, wait.
No?
Depends on the day. Day. In a sunny fall afternoon, yeah, pannenkoeken, pancakes. Yeah. But in a winter evening around New Year's or Christmas, yeah, poffertjes with powdered sugar. Absolutely. I like simple things. Stamppot met boerenkool.
Oh, love it.
That it's potato mash with kale in it, mixed up together, just like in the peasant way. I absolutely love that. You can take away the sausage. I'm less enthusiastic about Dutch sausages, but yeah, I like peasant stuff. My father, who had Danish roots, he had this running joke. He used to say, I have blue blood, which is Danish code for royal blood, like you're related to the royal family. Blue blood. I don't know
we have
why.
the same expression here in Holland.
Yeah?
We have the same expression, yeah.
Okay, so my father used to say, I have blue blood. I always said it jokingly, but he said it so consistently that as a kid, you believe it. He had this ham radio station, and ham radio stations have names. The radio operator gives a name to the station. So my father's station was Station Blue Blood. So it was such a enduring thing in his jokes that I thought it's real. And then he died. I was 12. And after he died, I made a comment to my grandmother, his mother, that I asked her, Grandma, what about our royal blood that father always talked about? And my grandmother had a laugh, it was a very sad period. She was always crying, always sad. And when I asked that, she burst into a spontaneous belly laugh. And he said, nonsense, we were peasants. We emigrated because we were dirt poor. We just didn't have means to leave. That's why the whole family emigrated to this faraway tropical land, this land of dreams here, where it's always warm and you never die of cold. And you throw a tomato on the ground, 2 months later, there's a tomato tree. I mean, for them, it was like paradise. I mean, is this even real? Can this really be true that such a place exists? They were poor. And when I heard that, something inside me relaxed. I can't describe it to you. A 12-year-old kid who hears that he doesn't have royal blood, he's a peasant. And I was like, oh, it was such a catharsis. It released me from something I didn't know was holding me. So yeah, I live in a boer. Let's speak English. I live in a. Now I have Dutch in my platteland. Someone met the boeren.
It's incredible to hear you say it in my language. So it's all right.
I live in the countryside with the farmers and very simple people. If I go for a beer, I live just outside Eindhoven. If I go for a beer, I go to these little towns here in the direction of Tilburg, really countryside, very simple people like Vessem, and they have good beer and spontaneous, good people that speak funny Dutch. They don't say een beetje, they say een beetje. And I love that. I just love it. It's so warm. I'm a peasant, man. I'm in heart and soul. All my 2 doctorates, all these degrees and this experience and CERN and whatnot. And it's facade. I am a peasant from Jutland. It's the peasant. Well, not anymore. Denmark is a modern country now. It's the poor side of, it's the continental part of Denmark, not in the islands. That's who I am, very proudly.
We love you for it. I love you for it, Bernardo. I think we're...
Thank you.
Really. It's, I think we're at the end now. It's 10:30.
I'm hungry.
You're hungry. You need to eat. So for everyone listening, thanks for chiming in. Thanks for your questions, Bernardo. Thanks for your time again, and again, thanks for your patience halfway through when the Zoom got out. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. And great questions. It's always fun to do this. I would do this again because the questions are always so nice.
Great.
So
I'll follow up.
Pleasure. Especially if you record and make it available to more people, even better.
I'll do it as fast as I can. It's not going to be tomorrow, but it's going to be soon.
No problem.
Yeah,
sure.
I'll let you know. I'll follow up. Thank you, Bernardo.
All right. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Take care.
Same. Have a good night.
Bye.